Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers, where deep ideas meet restful nights. If you enjoy these journeys through philosophy, please like and subscribe and turn on notifications for daily uploads. To support the channel, consider leaving a super thanks. Any amount helps us continue creating content. You can also become a member to request video topics. We're not monetized, so your support truly makes the difference. Now let the philosophy begin. Gettier problems. For over 2,000 years, philosophers believed they had a satisfactory definition of knowledge, tracing back to Plato's dialogue, theotatus, and this definition stated that knowledge is justified true belief, that to know a proposition, three conditions must be met. The proposition must be true, the believer must believe it, and the believer must have good reasons or justification for believing it. And this tripartite analysis seem to capture what knowledge is, to distinguish genuine knowledge from lucky guesses, false beliefs, and unjustified opinions. And the definition was widely accepted, taught in textbooks, treated as settled wisdom, until 1963, when a philosopher named Edmund Gettier published a 3-page paper that shattered this consensus and transformed epistemology. Gettier presented cases now known as Gettier problems or Gettier cases, where all three conditions for knowledge are satisfied, and yet intuitively the person does not have knowledge, where justified true belief is present but knowledge is absent. And these cases show that the traditional definition is insufficient, that something more is needed, though what that something is remains a matter of intense debate. The structure of a Gettier case typically involves a person who has a justified belief that happens to be true, but is true for reasons unrelated to the justification, where the justification is somehow defective or based on a falsehood, yet the belief turns out to be true by luck or coincidence. And this combination of justification and truth without the right kind of connection between them produces cases where we hesitate to attribute knowledge. Consider one of Gettier's original examples. Smith and Jones have applied for a job, and Smith has strong evidence that Jones will get the job. The president of the company told him so, and Smith also knows that Jones has 10 coins in his pocket. Smith counted them, and from these two pieces of evidence, Smith infers that the person who will get the job has 10 coins in his pocket, and this inference is justified. It follows logically from what Smith believes he knows. But unbeknownst to Smith, it is actually Smith himself who will get the job. The president was mistaken or changed his mind. And by an extraordinary coincidence, Smith also has 10 coins in his pocket. And so Smith's belief that the person who will get the job has 10 coins in his pocket is true. And it is justified based on apparently good evidence. And yet Smith does not know this truth, because his belief is true for the wrong reasons. True because of a coincidence, rather than because of the facts that justified it. Another classic example involves a person looking at a clock. The clock reads 3 o'clock, and the person forms the belief that it is 3 o'clock. And this belief is justified because clocks are generally reliable sources of time information. But unbeknownst to the person, the clock stopped exactly 12 hours ago and just happens to be showing the correct time again. And so the belief is justified and true, but does not constitute knowledge because the truth is accidental, unconnected to the reason for belief. Gettier cases have proliferated. Philosophers have constructed hundreds of variations, each designed to test different theories of knowledge, each revealing new wrinkles in the concept, and the common thread is that the justification and the truth come apart. The belief is true, but not because of the justification, or the justification is based on a falsehood that happens to lead to a true conclusion, or the truth obtains for reasons the believer is unaware of. And in all these cases we feel that something is missing, that the person has justified true belief but lacks knowledge. The philosophical response to Gettier has been to add a fourth condition to the definition of knowledge, to supplement justified true belief with some additional requirement that rules out Gettier cases, and many such conditions have been proposed. Some argue for a no false lemmas condition, requiring that the justification not depend on any false beliefs, so that in the job case, Smith's reasoning depended on the false belief that Jones would get the job, and this false lemma disqualifies the belief from being knowledge even though the conclusion is true. But this condition faces problems, because not all Gettier cases involve false lemmas. Some involve true beliefs that are justified by faulty processes or that happen to be true by luck without depending on any particular false intermediate belief. Others propose causal theories of knowledge, requiring that the belief be caused in the right way by the fact that makes it true, that there be a causal connection between the truth and the belief. And this would rule out the clock case, because the fact that it is 3 o'clock is not causally responsible for the clock showing 3 o'clock. The clock shows that time because it stopped 12 hours ago, not because it is currently 3 o'clock. But causal theories struggle with cases involving abstract objects or mathematical truths, where causal connections seem inappropriate or impossible. Reliabilist theories propose that knowledge requires belief to be produced by a reliable process, a process that generally produces true beliefs. And this seems to handle many Gettier cases, because the processes involved, like inferring from false beliefs or reading stopped clocks, are not reliable even if they happen to produce true beliefs in particular instances. But reliabilism faces the generality problem, the question of how to specify which process is operative in a given case, because any belief is produced by many processes at different levels of generality, and depending on how the process is described, it may be reliable or unreliable. Safety and sensitivity conditions have also been proposed. Safety requires that in nearby possible worlds, where the person still believes the proposition is still true, that the belief could not easily have been false. And sensitivity requires that in nearby worlds, where the proposition is false, the person would not believe it. And these modal conditions attempt to capture the idea that knowledge requires a stable connection between belief and truth, a connection that holds not just in the actual world, but in close counterfactual situations, but both conditions face counterexamples and refinements continue. Virtue epistemology offers another approach, suggesting that knowledge requires belief to be produced by the exercise of intellectual virtues, by cognitive abilities and skills that are credit to the agent. And on this view, Gettier cases fail to be knowledge, because the truth of the belief is not attributable to the cognitive abilities of the believer, but to luck or coincidence. But this raises questions about how to individuate abilities, about what counts as an exercise of skill versus a lucky outcome, and about whether knowledge really requires that the believer deserve credit for getting things right. The debate over Gettier cases has dominated analytic epistemology for over 60 years, generating thousands of papers, dozens of theories, and no clear consensus. And some philosophers have begun to question whether the project of defining knowledge in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions is misguided, whether knowledge is a natural kind with sharp boundaries, or whether it is a cluster concept, a family resemblance term that cannot be captured by a precise definition. And experimental philosophers have tested intuitions about Gettier cases across different cultures and demographics, finding some variation and raising questions about whose intuitions should guide philosophical theorizing. Gettier's legacy is immense. His 3-page paper demolished a definition that stood for millennia and launched an industry of epistemological research. And while the original problem, finding necessary and sufficient conditions for knowledge, remains unsolved, the attempt has deepened our understanding of justification, truth, belief, luck, causation, and the complex relationships between them. And Gettier cases continue to serve as test cases for theories of knowledge, as benchmarks that any adequate theory must handle. And they remind us that even our most basic concepts, even something as central as knowledge itself, are more complex and more elusive than they first appear, that definitions are hard to come by, that counterexamples lurk around every corner, and that the philosophical quest for clarity and precision is never-ending, always encountering new obstacles, new puzzles, new reasons to question what seemed settled. And Smith stands there with his 10 coins, believing truly and with justification that the person who will get the job has 10 coins in his pocket. And yet he does not know. And this simple case, this small story about a job and some coins, contains within it a challenge that philosophy has not yet met, a puzzle that refuses to be solved, a gap between justified true belief and knowledge that no fourth condition has successfully closed, and the search continues. Philosophers proposing new theories, new conditions, new ways of understanding what knowledge is and what distinguishes it from mere lucky true belief. And Gettier watches from beyond the grave, his 3 pages having accomplished what few philosophical works ever do, fundamentally reshaping the discipline, forcing a rethinking of basic assumptions, proving that even ancient wisdom is vulnerable too. Counterexample, and that the road to philosophical truth is longer and more winding than we imagined. Cantor's paradox. Georg Cantor, the mathematician who revolutionized our understanding of infinity by developing set theory and demonstrating that infinite sets come in different sizes, encountered a paradox that threatened the foundations of his own creation. And this paradox asks a simple question that leads to contradiction. What is the cardinality of the set of all sets? What is the size of the collection that contains every possible set as a member? And Cantor's theorem, one of his most important results, states that for any set, the power set, the set of all subsets of that set, has strictly greater cardinality than the original set, meaning there is no one-to-one correspondence between a set and its power set. The power set is always larger, and this theorem applies to finite sets, where the power set of a set with n elements has 2 to the power n elements, and it applies to infinite sets as well. The power set of the natural numbers, which is the set of all subsets of natural numbers, has greater cardinality than the natural numbers themselves. It is uncountably infinite, while the natural numbers are merely countably infinite. The paradox emerges when we apply Cantor's theorem to the set of all sets, because if there is a set that contains every set as a member, including itself and all its subsets, then we can consider the power set of this universal set, the collection of all subsets of the set of all sets, and by Cantor's theorem this power set must have greater cardinality than the set of all sets. But every subset of the set of all sets is itself a set, and therefore must be a member of the set of all sets, because the set of all sets contains every set. And so, the power set is contained within the set of all sets. It cannot be larger, and yet Cantor's theorem says it must be larger, and this contradiction is Cantor's paradox, a proof that the set of all sets cannot exist, that naive set theory, which allows the formation of any collection that can be described, is inconsistent. The paradox is related to Russell's paradox, which also exposes contradictions in naive set theory by considering the set of all sets that do not contain themselves, and both paradoxes revealed that unrestricted set formation leads to contradictions, that not every collection can be a set, and that mathematics needed a more careful foundation, and this led to the development of axiomatic set theories like Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory, which impose restrictions on what sets can be formed, typically by avoiding self-reference and by building sets up gradually from simpler sets using specified operations. And in these axiomatic systems, the set of all sets does not exist. The formation of such a set is not permitted by the axioms, and the paradox is avoided by denying the existence of the problematic collection. Cantor's paradox raises deep questions about the nature of infinity and totality, about whether there is a largest infinity, a biggest collection, and the paradox suggests that there is no largest cardinal number, that for any infinite size there is a larger infinite size obtained by taking the power set, and this hierarchy extends without bound. There is no top, no final level, no set that contains all sets, and This open-endedness is both mathematically fruitful, providing an endless source of new infinities to study, and philosophically troubling, suggesting that mathematical reality has no completion, no ultimate totality, no grand unified structure that encompasses everything. Some philosophers and logicians have proposed alternative set theories that handle totalities differently, class theories that distinguish between sets, which can be members of other collections, and proper classes, which are too large to be members. And in these theories, the collection of all sets is a proper class, not a set, and proper classes cannot be members of other classes. And this distinction blocks the formation of the power class of the class of all sets, preventing the contradiction, and category theory provides another framework where collections are organized into categories, and the totality of all sets forms a category, but not a set within any category. And these approaches allow mathematicians to talk about very large collections without generating contradictions. Cantor himself was deeply troubled by the paradoxes. He recognized that his set theory, which had seemed so clear and powerful, contained internal tensions, and he distinguished between consistent and inconsistent multiplicities, between collections that can coherently be treated as completed totalities and collections that resist such treatment. And the set of all sets, Cantor suggested, is an inconsistent multiplicity, an absolutely infinite collection that cannot be captured by any mathematical structure, and this distinction prefigures the later technical solutions, but leaves open philosophical questions about what it means for a collection to be too large to be a set, about whether size alone determines sethood, or whether other factors are involved. The paradox also connects to issues in the philosophy of mathematics about the existence and reality of mathematical objects. Because if the set of all sets cannot exist, if forming such a collection leads to contradiction, then what does this say about mathematical existence? Is existence in mathematics constrained by consistency, such that only consistent collections exist? Or is there some Platonic realm of mathematical objects that includes inconsistent or impossible collections? And if the former, then mathematics is more restrictive than it might have seemed. Not every describable collection corresponds to a real mathematical object. And if the latter, then mathematics must find ways to avoid reasoning about impossible objects, must develop formal systems that do not permit the formation of contradictory sets, even if such sets in some sense exist beyond the formal systems. Cantor's paradox remains central to the foundations of mathematics. It is one of the key examples that motivated the development of rigorous axiomatic set theory. It illustrates the dangers of unrestricted comprehension, the principle that any property defines a set, and it shows that even the most basic concepts, like the concept of a set or the concept of all, require careful handling to avoid contradiction. And the paradox endures as a reminder that infinity is subtle, that totality is elusive, that the attempt to capture everything in a single structure leads to collapse, and that mathematics must proceed carefully, must impose restrictions, must accept that not everything that can be described can be mathematically realized, and the set of all sets sits in liminal space, neither existing nor not existing, describable but not constructible, thinkable but not formalizable. And the paradox persists, a boundary marker that shows where set theory ends, where the axioms say no more, where the attempt to go beyond breaks down into contradiction. And Cantor's vision of a hierarchy of infinities, beautiful and profound, remains intact. But the pinnacle is missing. There is no largest set, no final infinity, no ultimate totality, only an endless ascent through larger and larger collections, each one surpassed by its power set. And the paradox ensures that the ascent never ends, that mathematics has no ceiling, no completion, and that infinity, for all its strangeness and power, remains forever beyond our capacity to fully encompass or exhaust. Why is there something rather than nothing? The question that breaks philosophy. A child asks the simplest and most profound question, looks at the world and wonders why it exists, why there is anything at all rather than empty void, blank nothingness, total absence of being. And this question has been called the fundamental question of metaphysics, has been asked by philosophers across centuries, has been approached from countless angles, and yet no satisfactory answer has emerged. No explanation that resolves the mystery, and the question persists, stubborn and unanswerable. And this very persistence suggests something deep, suggests that the question may be unanswerable. Not because we lack knowledge, but because answers are impossible, because the structure of explanation breaks down when applied to existence itself, because the question demands something that cannot be given. And this is why the question, why is there something rather than nothing, breaks philosophy, reveals limits of rational inquiry, shows that not all questions have answers, that mystery is ineliminable, and that existence is the ultimate brute fact, the foundation that supports all explanations but cannot itself be explained without circularity or infinite regress. Imagine absolute nothingness more carefully, not empty space which is still something, not darkness which requires time and the absence of light, not even the potential for something, but pure nothing. No properties, no possibilities, no structure, no existence whatsoever. And from this pure nothing, ask how something could arise, what could cause the first thing to exist. And the problem is that causation requires existence, requires that there be things to cause effects, and pure nothing contains no causes, no mechanisms, no laws, nothing that could produce anything. And so the transition from nothing to something seems impossible, seems to violate every principle of explanation we have. And yet something exists, we exist, the universe exists, and so either something has always existed, no pure nothing ever obtained, or something arose from nothing, violated the principles, performed the impossible, and either option is difficult to accept. Either challenges fundamental assumptions about explanation and causation. The question, why is there something rather than nothing, presupposes that nothing is the default state, the natural condition, and something requires explanation, requires justification, requires accounting for why the default was departed from. But this presupposition is questionable. Why should nothing be privileged over something? Why should absence be more natural than presence? And perhaps something is just as natural as nothing, just as much the default. And the question dissolves, becomes a pseudo-question based on unjustified privileging of one state over another. And asking why something rather than nothing is like asking why up rather than down when there is no absolute reference frame, when up and down are arbitrary. And the question assumes something that should not be assumed. Visualize the logical space of possibilities. One possibility is that nothing exists. Another is that something exists. And the question asks why actuality corresponds to the something possibility rather than the nothing possibility. But this assumes that actuality could have corresponded to either, that both are genuine possibilities and perhaps nothing is not a genuine possibility. Perhaps nothingness is unstable, self-contradictory, cannot obtain, and something must exist. Existence is necessary. And the question is based on false assumption that nothing was ever a real alternative. And if nothing is impossible, then existence requires no explanation beyond its necessity, and the question collapses. One approach to the question appeals to the principle of sufficient reason, the principle that everything has an explanation, that for every fact there is a reason why it is so rather than otherwise. And this principle seems to demand an answer to why something rather than nothing seems to require that existence have explanation. But the principle leads to problems, leads to infinite regress if every explanation requires further explanation, or leads to circular explanation if the chain of reasons loops back. And perhaps the principle itself is false. Perhaps not everything has explanation. Perhaps existence is the brute fact, the unexplained explainer. The ground of reasons that itself has no reason, and accepting this requires abandoning the principle of sufficient reason, requires accepting that the demand for total explanation cannot be satisfied. Another approach appeals to God, argues that God exists necessarily, by divine nature, cannot fail to exist, and God created the universe, explains why something rather than nothing, but this pushes the question back, asks why God exists, why there is a necessary being rather than no necessary beings, and if God's existence is brute fact, then why not make the universe's existence brute fact? Why the extra step? And theistic answers to the question seem to relocate the mystery rather than resolving it. Replace the mystery of why anything exists with the mystery of why God exists. And while some find this satisfying, find the existence of God less mysterious than the existence of a universe, others see no progress, see the same question at a different level. A third approach from quantum cosmology suggests that universes can arise from quantum fluctuations, that the vacuum is unstable, that particles pop into existence from nothing due to quantum indeterminacy, and perhaps the entire universe is a quantum fluctuation, arose from quantum vacuum without cause. And this seems to answer the question, explain something rather than nothing through quantum mechanics. But critics point out that quantum vacuum is not nothing, is a structure governed by laws, has properties and possibilities. And so the question becomes, why is there quantum vacuum rather than nothing? Why are there laws of quantum mechanics? And the question is pushed back but not answered. And quantum cosmology explains how our universe arose, but not why anything exists at all. The question also appears in theological contexts, in arguments about whether the universe requires a creator, whether existence points to God, and the cosmological argument says that the universe's existence requires explanation, and the explanation is God. But this argument faces the same problem. Why does God exist? And if God exists necessarily, then why can't the universe exist necessarily? And the theist and atheist reach an impasse, both accepting that something exists without ultimate explanation, disagreeing only about whether that something is God or the universe. And the fundamental question remains unanswered by both. And perhaps this reveals that the question is unanswerable, is beyond the reach of rational argument. Some philosophers conclude that the question, why is there something rather than nothing, is meaningless, is not a genuine question, is based on grammatical confusion, treats existence as if it were a property that things might have or lack when existence is not a property, but is the precondition for having properties, and asking why things have the property of existence is like asking why round things are shaped, is based on category error, and the question should be abandoned, recognized as pseudo-question, and philosophy should focus on questions that can meaningfully be asked and answered. And this deflationary response treats the question as linguistic confusion rather than deep mystery. Others embrace the mystery, accept that the question has no answer, that existence is the ultimate mystery, the foundation of everything, and confronting this mystery produces feelings of awe, wonder, recognition of the strangeness and precariousness of existence. The fact that there is something rather than nothing seems miraculous, seems gratuitous, seems like it did not have to be this way. And this feeling, this sense of wonder at existence itself, is one of the sources of both philosophy and religion. And the question, why is there something rather than nothing, even if unanswerable, is valuable, is worth asking, because it opens us to the fundamental mystery, reminds us that existence is not self-explanatory, is not inevitable, is something that calls out for explanation, even if no explanation can be given. The child asks why and the adult struggles to answer, offers various responses, scientific or theological or philosophical, and none fully satisfy, none explain why existence itself occurs, why being rather than non-being. And the question remains, breaks philosophy, reveals limits, shows that explanation must end somewhere, that understanding has boundaries, And perhaps this is the deepest lesson, that mystery is ineliminable, that existence is fundamentally inexplicable, and we must live with this, must accept that the most basic fact that something exists has no explanation, is just the way things are, and the question persists unanswered, echoing through philosophy, and existence remains strange and inexplicable, and the universe continues, and we ask why, and no answer comes, and the question endures. Yablo's paradox. In 1993, the philosopher Stephen Yablo introduced a paradox that seemed impossible, a self-referential contradiction that contains no self-reference at all, a loop without a loop. And this paradox has troubled logicians ever since because it challenges the assumption that all semantic paradoxes arise from statements referring to themselves. Imagine an infinite sequence of sentences, each one numbered, and each sentence says the same kind of thing. Sentence 1 says for all sentences, after this one, at least one of them is false. Sentence 2 says for all sentences, after this one, at least one of them is false. Sentence 3 says the same, and so on forever, each sentence making a claim about all the sentences that come after it, but never referring to itself or to any sentence that comes before. Now consider whether sentence 1 is true. If it is true, then at least one sentence after it must be false. So sentence 2 or 3 or some later sentence must be false. But sentence 2 makes the same claim as sentence 1, just shifted down the sequence. So if sentence 2 is false, then all sentences after it must be true. But sentence 3 says at least one sentence after it is false, which contradicts the idea that all sentences after sentence 2 are true, and so sentence 2 cannot be false. And the same reasoning applies to every sentence in the sequence. None of them can be false without contradiction, which means all of them must be true. But if all of them are true, then sentence 1's claim that at least one sentence after it is false must itself be false, and so we arrive at a contradiction without any sentence ever referring to itself. The paradox is startling because it was long believed that self-reference was the root of all semantic paradoxes, that statements like this sentence is false create problems precisely because they loop back on themselves. But Yablo's paradox suggests that infinite chains of reference can generate the same kind of contradiction, even when each individual sentence only points forward, never backward. Some philosophers argue that Yablo's paradox is secretly self-referential after all, that the infinite sequence as a whole refers to itself in some implicit way, or that each sentence indirectly refers to itself through the mediation of the sentences that follow. But others insist that the paradox is genuinely non-self-referential, that it reveals a new kind of logical pathology that cannot be explained by the old models. The paradox has deep implications for theories of truth, because if self-reference is not necessary for paradox, then many proposed solutions to the liar paradox and related problems must be reconsidered, and new strategies must be developed to handle infinite structures that generate contradiction through endless forward reference, rather than immediate loops. Some logicians suggest that the paradox arises because we are treating an infinite sequence of statements as if it were a completed whole, and that in a finite or constructive framework, the paradox would dissolve, while others embrace infinitary logic and try to develop formal systems that can accommodate Yablo's structure without collapsing into inconsistency. The paradox also connects to issues in recursion theory and computer science, where infinite loops and non-terminating processes can exhibit similar behavior, generating contradictions or undefined results, without any single step referring back to a previous one. Yablo's paradox stands as a reminder that infinity is strange, that logic stretched across endless sequences behaves in ways that defy intuition, and that the boundaries of coherent thought may be more fragile than we imagined, that even without the familiar twist of self-reference, language and logic can still tie themselves into knots from which there is no escape. Zubov's paradox, a thought experiment in personal identity, asks us to imagine a machine that can instantly create a perfect duplicate of a person, atom by atom, molecule by molecule, and the duplicate is placed in a different location, perhaps on Mars while the original remains on Earth, and both individuals emerge from the process with all the same memories, the same personality, the same sense of being the person who entered the machine. And now the question arises, which one is the real person? Which one continues the original stream of consciousness? And Zuboff's paradox, presented by Arnold Zuboff, pushes this scenario further by asking what happens if the duplication process creates not just one copy, but many copies, perhaps millions, all scattered across the universe, all emerging simultaneously with the same memories and the same conviction that they are the original person. And the paradox is that if one copy preserves personal identity, then it seems that all copies should preserve it. But if all copies are the original person, then identity has become plural. One person has become many. And this seems to violate the transitivity and uniqueness of identity. The principle that identity is a one-to-one relation, that if A is identical to B and A is identical to C, then B must be identical to C. But if millions of copies all claim to be the original person and none has a privileged status, then they cannot all be numerically identical to each other. They are distinct individuals occupying different locations. And so, identity seems to have been destroyed or multiplied in ways that make no sense. The paradox challenges the intuition that psychological continuity is sufficient for personal identity. The view associated with John Locke and Derek Parfit that what makes a future person the same person as a present person is the continuity of memories, personality, beliefs, desires, and other psychological characteristics. And this view seems plausible when considering ordinary cases of survival through time. The person who wakes up tomorrow is the same person who went to sleep tonight, because there is psychological continuity, but the duplication case shows that psychological continuity cannot be sufficient for identity because identity is one-to-one, while psychological continuity can be one-to-many. Multiple future individuals can all be psychologically continuous with a single past individual, and if we say that only one of them is the original person, then we need a criterion to distinguish that one from the others. And no such criterion seems available if all the copies are physically and psychologically identical. Zuboff's contribution is to emphasize the symmetry of the situation. When there are multiple copies and no physical or psychological differences between them, there is no non-arbitrary way to select one as the original, and the others as mere copies, and if we are forced to say that none of them is the original, that personal identity was destroyed by the duplication process, then we must accept that identity is incompatible with duplication, that what matters for survival is not just psychological continuity, but also the absence of competitors, the requirement that there be, at most, one future individual who is psychologically continuous with the present individual. And this requirement seems strange, seems to make identity depend on what happens to other people, on whether duplicates exist rather than on intrinsic facts about the individual's own physical and psychological continuity. The paradox connects to debates about what matters in survival. Parfit argued that identity is not what matters, that what we care about when we care about survival is not numerical identity, but psychological connectedness and continuity. And if these can be preserved and even multiplied, then we should regard that as a good thing, as a kind of proliferation of what matters, rather than a loss of identity. And Parfit bit the bullet, accepting that in duplication cases, the original person does not survive as a single individual, but survives in a broader sense as multiple individuals, each with equal claim to being a continuation of the original. And this view dissolves the paradox by rejecting the assumption that survival requires identity, but it strikes many people as counterintuitive, as a refusal to take seriously the distinctness of persons. The fact that I am one person, not many, and that survival means that I, this particular individual, continue to exist. Not that some psychologically similar individuals exist. Others have proposed that identity in duplication cases is vague or indeterminate, that there is no fact of the matter about which copy, if any, is the original. That identity admits of degrees or borderline cases. And this indeterminacy is not a sign of ignorance, but a feature of the metaphysics, a reflection of the fact that identity is a coarse-grained concept that breaks down in cases involving fission or duplication. And while this response accommodates the intuition that duplication creates a puzzle, it does so by accepting that some questions about identity have no determinate answers. And this itself is a controversial metaphysical commitment. Still others distinguish between survival and identity, arguing that survival is a looser relation than identity, that survival can occur without identity if there is sufficient continuity and connectedness, and that in duplication cases, all the copies survive, even though none is identical to the original. And this view preserves the one-to-one nature of identity, while allowing that what we care about, survival, can be a one-to-many relation, and it provides a framework for thinking about duplication that does not force us to choose between denying continuity matters or accepting the multiplication of identity. Zuboff's paradox also has implications for practical ethics, for questions about the permissibility of creating duplicates, about whether duplicating a person harms them or benefits them or does neither, about whether the duplicates have the same rights and responsibilities as the original, and about how to distribute resources or assign credit and blame when multiple individuals all have equal claim to being the continuation of a single person. And these questions have no obvious answers. They require rethinking fundamental assumptions about personhood, autonomy, and moral status. The duplication machine hums. The original person steps inside, and moments later, millions of copies emerge across the universe, each one waking with the conviction that they are the person who entered the machine, each one feeling the continuity of consciousness, the persistence of memory, the seamless transition from before to after. And yet, something has changed. Identity has fractured or multiplied or disappeared, and the paradox asks what has happened, what it means to survive when survival takes this form, and the answers do not come easily. They require choosing between intuitions that cannot all be preserved, between the importance of identity and the importance of continuity, between the uniqueness of persons and the possibility of multiplication. And Zuboff's paradox remains a powerful challenge to theories of personal identity, a thought experiment that exposes tensions and forces choices, and it endures as a puzzle that has no consensus solution, no answer that satisfies all intuitions, only a set of options, each with costs, each requiring the abandonment of something we thought was certain, and the copies live their lives, scattered across space, each believing themselves to be the original, and perhaps they are, or perhaps none of them are, or perhaps the question has no answer, and the paradox persists, unresolved, a permanent feature of the landscape of personal identity. A reminder that who we are, what it means to survive, what it means to be the same person over time, are questions that remain open, that resist final answers, and that become stranger and more perplexing the more carefully we examine them. Zeno's dichotomy paradox. To reach a destination, one must first travel half the distance, and before reaching that halfway point, one must first travel half of that. And before reaching that point, one must travel half again. And this process of halving continues infinitely, and so it seems that motion cannot even begin, for there is always another halfway point that must be reached first. And this is Zeno's dichotomy paradox, one of the earliest and most famous arguments against the possibility of motion and change. Imagine a runner who wishes to cross a stadium. Before reaching the far end, they must reach the midpoint. but before reaching the midpoint, they must reach the quarter point, and before that, the eighth point, and so on, dividing the distance into ever smaller intervals without end. And since there are infinitely many such intervals, the runner would have to complete infinitely many tasks. And how can anyone complete an infinite number of tasks in a finite amount of time? And yet runners do cross stadiums, people do move from place to place, and so something must be wrong with the argument. But what? Zeno devised this paradox in the 5th century BCE to defend the philosophy of his teacher Parmenides, who claimed that reality is a single, unchanging unity, and that plurality and motion are illusions. And the dichotomy paradox was meant to show that the very concept of motion leads to absurdity, that if space and time can be divided infinitely, then movement becomes impossible, and therefore our perception of motion must be mistaken. Aristotle responded by distinguishing between potential and actual infinity, arguing that while the distance can potentially be divided into infinitely many parts, the runner does not actually traverse each part individually. The runner simply crosses the distance as a continuous whole, and the infinite division is something we can imagine, but not something the runner must perform. The paradox remained troubling for centuries, until the development of calculus in the 17th century by Newton and Leibniz, which provided mathematical tools to handle infinite sums and showed that an infinite series can converge to a finite value, 1/2 plus 1/4 plus 1/8, and so on adds up to exactly 1. And so the runner crossing infinitely many intervals in finite time is not a contradiction, but a mathematical fact. The sum of the infinite series equals the total distance, and the sum of the corresponding time intervals equals the total time. Yet some philosophers argue that the mathematical solution does not fully dissolve the conceptual problem, that even if the infinite series converges, there is still something mysterious about how an infinite process can be completed, how something that has no end can nevertheless reach an end, and whether the smooth continuous motion we experience is truly composed of infinitely many discrete steps, or whether motion is fundamentally continuous and indivisible. The paradox also raises questions about the structure of space and time, whether they are infinitely divisible, or whether there is a smallest possible unit of distance or duration, a quantum of space or time beyond which further division is meaningless. And modern physics has explored such ideas through quantum mechanics and theories of space-time foam, where the smooth fabric of reality may break down at extremely small scales. Zeno's dichotomy forces confrontation with infinity, with the strange fact that between any 2 points lie infinitely many other points, that the finite contains the infinite, that the continuous emerges from, or perhaps is the discrete, and that motion, the most familiar and undeniable aspect of existence, rests on foundations that are anything but solid. The runner crosses the stadium, the arrow flies, the universe moves and changes, and yet Zeno's voice echoes across the millennia, asking how, asking whether what seems so obvious might be impossible, whether the world we experience is the world that actually is, and whether reason and perception can ever be reconciled when one says motion is real and the other says motion leads to paradox. Buridan's ass, when perfect balance creates perfect paralysis. A donkey stands exactly halfway between two identical bales of hay, equidistant from both, and the donkey is hungry, equally attracted to both bales, and both bales are identical in size, quality, freshness, and appeal, and there is no reason to prefer one over the other, no difference that would make choosing one more rational than choosing the other. And according to the principle of sufficient reason, the idea that every choice must have a reason, that rational action requires a reason to prefer one option over alternatives. The donkey cannot choose because choosing either bale would be arbitrary, would be action without sufficient reason, and so the donkey stands paralyzed, unable to move toward either bale, and eventually starves to death despite being surrounded by food. And this is Buridan's ass, a thought experiment in medieval philosophy named after Jean Buridan, though the paradox predates him, and it illustrates a problem with certain models of rational choice, shows that if rationality requires sufficient reason for every choice, then perfect symmetry creates paralysis, creates situations where rational action becomes impossible. Imagine the donkey's perspective, looking left at one bale, looking right at the other, evaluating, comparing, and finding them perfectly equal. No basis for preference, no reason to go left rather than right or right rather than left. And the principle of sufficient reason says that to act rationally, the donkey needs a reason, needs something that makes one option better. And in the absence of such a reason, the donkey should not act, should remain neutral, should not arbitrarily favour one identical option over another. And so the donkey stays in place, and the bales remain equidistant, and time passes, and hunger grows, but still no reason emerges to break the symmetry. And the donkey, committed to rational decision-making, committed to acting only when there is sufficient reason, cannot move, and the commitment to rationality becomes a death sentence. The paradox challenges the principle of sufficient reason, challenges the idea that rational action always requires a reason to prefer one option over alternatives. Because in situations of perfect symmetry, there is no such reason, and yet acting is better than not acting. Choosing either Balo is better than choosing neither, and survival requires breaking the symmetry. Somehow requires choosing arbitrarily, and if arbitrary choice is allowed, then the principle of sufficient reason is false, is not a requirement of rationality, and if arbitrary choice is not allowed, then rationality becomes self-defeating in symmetric situations, becomes a principle that prevents beneficial action, and neither option is attractive. Neither preserves our intuitions about what rationality requires. Visualize the situation as a balance, perfectly level, with equal weights on both sides, and the donkey as the fulcrum, unable to tip in either direction because the forces are equal. And tipping requires an imbalance, requires one side to outweigh the other, but no such imbalance exists, and so the balance remains level, and the donkey remains centered. And the metaphor captures the paralysis, the inability to move, when reasons are perfectly balanced, when no consideration favors one option over another. One response to the paradox is to deny that such perfect symmetry ever occurs in reality, to argue that there are always small differences, imperceptible perhaps, but sufficient to break ties. One bale is slightly closer or slightly greener, or catches the light differently. And even if these differences are too small to consciously notice, they provide sufficient reason for the unconscious decision-making processes that guide action, and so real donkeys never face perfect symmetry, never actually starve between identical bales, because nothing in nature is perfectly identical. And the paradox is a thought experiment that does not correspond to any actual situation. And while this may be true for physical objects, the paradox still applies to abstract choices, where perfect symmetry can be stipulated, and so the response avoids the real problem rather than solving it. Another response is to modify the principle of sufficient reason to allow arbitrary choice in symmetric situations, to say that rationality requires reasons to prefer one option over another when such reasons exist, but when options are genuinely equal, then arbitrary choice is rational, is indeed the only rational response. And in cases of perfect symmetry, choosing randomly is not irrational, but is the rational thing to do. And the donkey should flip a mental coin, should pick arbitrarily, should recognize that in the absence of reasons to distinguish between options, any choice is as good as any other, and making an arbitrary choice is better than making no choice. And this response preserves rationality while allowing action in symmetric cases. But it requires weakening the principle of sufficient reason, requires admitting that not all rational actions have reasons, that sometimes the rational thing is to act arbitrarily. A third response appeals to higher order considerations, argues that even when two options are equally good in terms of immediate outcomes, they may differ in terms of meta-level features, and the donkey should consider not just which bale to eat, but also principles of decision-making, and there are good reasons to have a policy of breaking ties somehow, perhaps always choosing the left option in symmetric cases, or always choosing randomly, and having such a policy provides sufficient reason to choose even when the options themselves provide no reason. And the donkey, who has adopted the policy of going left in symmetric situations, has a reason to go left. The reason is not that the left bale is better, but that the policy says to go left. And this preserves sufficient reason at a higher level while allowing action at the object level. But it raises questions about where the higher level policy comes from, whether adopting the policy itself requires sufficient reason, and whether we have just pushed the problem back one level without solving it. The paradox also connects to debates about free will and determinism, because if every choice requires a sufficient reason, a cause that explains why that choice was made rather than another, then in situations of perfect symmetry, no choice can be made. And yet humans and animals do make choices in such situations, do break ties, and this suggests that not all choices are determined by reasons, that there is some indeterminacy, some capacity for arbitrary choice, and libertarians about free will embrace this, argue that free will requires the ability to choose without sufficient determining reasons, requires that agents can tip the balance even when reasons are equal, but compatibilists and determinists argue that apparent symmetry is always broken by hidden factors, by unconscious preferences or random neural fluctuations, and what looks like arbitrary choice is actually determined by factors we do not consciously access. The paradox appears in practical contexts involving decision-making under uncertainty, where multiple options have equal expected value, and decision theory must specify what to do in such cases. And most theories say to choose randomly, to treat equal value options as interchangeable. And this is the rational response, but it requires abandoning the strong version of sufficient reason, requires accepting that rational choice sometimes is arbitrary choice, and this has implications for ethics and policy, for situations where multiple actions are equally good, where no moral consideration distinguishes between them. And in such cases, acting is better than paralysis, and any permissible action can be chosen without need for further justification. The donkey stands motionless, hunger gnawing, hay on both sides, and the commitment to sufficient reason becomes a trap, becomes a principle that prevents survival, and the paradox remains, challenging rationality, forcing recognition that reason has limits, that symmetry creates problems, that pure rationality cannot solve, that arbitrary choice, far from being irrational, is sometimes the only rational response. And Buridan's ass endures, starving between equal bales, a symbol of the perils of excessive rationality, of the dangers of demanding reasons when none exist. And the paradox persists as a reminder that action requires more than reason, requires the capacity to break ties, to choose when choices are equal, to act despite the absence of sufficient reason. And rational agents, whether donkeys or humans, must possess this capacity or risk paralysis, risk standing frozen while opportunities pass and the ass remains. Hypothetical but instructive, teaching that rationality is not just about having good reasons, but also about knowing when reasons run out and arbitrary choice must begin. Laplace's demon, the mind that knows everything that will ever happen. A supremely intelligent being, a vast intellect that knows the position and velocity of every particle in the universe at a single instant, stands outside time and space. And this being, this demon, as Pierre-Simon Laplace called it in 1814, possesses the complete laws of physics, the equations that govern how particles interact and move, and with this information, the precise state of every atom and the exact rules of motion. The demon can calculate the future, can determine with perfect accuracy where every particle will be at any future time, can predict every event, every thought, every decision, every outcome, from the fall of a raindrop to the rise of civilizations, from the collision of atoms to the death of stars. And in principle, the demon could also calculate the past, could trace every particle's trajectory backward to determine exactly how the present arose from previous states. And so this demon, given sufficient computational power, could know everything that has happened and everything that will happen. The entire history of the universe, past and future, encoded in a single snapshot of the present. And this is Laplace's demon, a thought experiment about determinism, about whether the universe is a clockwork mechanism, where the future is entirely determined by the past, where free will is an illusion, where everything that will ever happen is already decided, already implicit in the current state of things. Imagine the demon's knowledge as a vast table, infinitely long, listing the position and velocity of every particle, every electron, every quark, every photon, trillions upon trillions upon trillions of entries, and the demon has access to all this information perfectly, knows it exactly, with infinite precision. And the demon also knows Newton's laws, or perhaps Einstein's field equations, or quantum mechanics, knows the rules that govern how these particles influence each other, how forces propagate, how energy transfers. And with this knowledge, the demon can simulate the universe, can run the equations forward in time, calculating step by step how the particles will move, how they will collide and interact, and the simulation produces a prediction, a complete specification of the universe at every future moment. And this prediction, if the laws of physics are deterministic, is not probabilistic but certain. The future is determined, fixed, inevitable, and the demon knows it all. The implications are profound and troubling, because if Laplace's demon is possible, if the universe is deterministic, then free will becomes problematic, becomes perhaps an illusion, because every decision you make, every thought you have, every action you take is the result of particles in your brain following physical laws, and those particles are moving according to rules determined by their initial conditions, and those initial conditions were set by earlier states, going back to the beginning of the universe. And so your choices are not free but predetermined, decided billions of years ago when the universe began, and you are not an agent but an automaton, a complex machine that operates according to fixed rules. And the feeling of making choices, of deliberating and deciding, is a subjective experience produced by computational processes in your brain. But the outcome was never in doubt, was determined from the start. And this conclusion undermines moral responsibility, undermines the concepts of praise and blame, undermines the notion that people could have done otherwise, and it raises the question of what it means to be human if our actions are all predetermined. But Laplace's demon faces several obstacles, several reasons why even in principle it might be impossible. The first obstacle is quantum mechanics, which was unknown in Laplace's time, but is now recognized as fundamental to physics, and quantum mechanics is probabilistic, not deterministic. The Heisenberg uncertainty principle states that we cannot know both the position and velocity of a particle with perfect precision. There is an irreducible indeterminacy, a fundamental limit on what can be known, and when we measure a quantum system, the outcome is random, governed by probabilities but not determined. And so Laplace's demon cannot have the precise initial conditions it needs, cannot know the exact state of the universe, and even if it could, the laws of quantum mechanics only predict probabilities for future events, not certainties, and so the future is genuinely open, not determined, and Laplace's demon is impossible. The second obstacle is chaos sensitivity to initial conditions, where tiny unmeasurable differences in starting states lead to vastly different outcomes over time. Weather systems, planetary orbits, fluid flows, all exhibit chaotic behavior, where prediction becomes impossible beyond a certain time horizon, because errors in measurement, no matter how small, grow exponentially and eventually dominate. And even if quantum mechanics were not an issue, even in a classical deterministic universe, practical prediction would be impossible for chaotic systems, and the demon would need infinite precision, infinitely accurate knowledge of initial conditions, and any finite approximation, no matter how good, would fail after sufficient time. And so the demon's predictions would be useless for complex systems on long time scales. The third obstacle is computational. Even if the demon had perfect information and deterministic laws, simulating the universe requires computing power, requires processing the interactions of every particle, and the universe contains roughly 10 to the 80 particles, and computing their evolution requires resources. And some physicists have argued that simulating the universe would require a computer as large as the universe itself, and such a computer could not run faster than the universe it simulates, could not predict the future faster than the future unfolds. And so the demon could not tell you tomorrow's events before tomorrow arrives, and the demon becomes useless as a predictor, reduced to a mere recorder that reconstructs what has already happened, rather than foretelling what will happen. Visualize the universe as a vast machine, gears turning, particles moving, and Laplace's demon standing outside, watching the machine, knowing the position of every gear, the velocity of every component, and calculating how the machine will continue to turn. But the demon is blocked by quantum uncertainty, cannot measure the gears precisely enough, is blocked by chaos, cannot maintain accuracy over time, is blocked by computational limits, cannot perform the calculation fast enough. And so the demon, mighty as it seems, is impossible. The universe resists total prediction, resists complete knowledge, not because of practical limitations, but because of fundamental features of physical law and determinism. Even if it were true, does not grant us the power to predict. And the demon remains a thought experiment, a symbol of a kind of knowledge that cannot exist, a vision of omniscience that is ruled out by the nature of reality itself. Laplace's demon also raises philosophical questions about explanation and understanding, because even if we cannot predict the future, even if determinism fails or the demon is impossible, we still seek to explain why things happen, to trace causes and effects, to understand the mechanisms that generate events. And this explanatory project does not require Laplacian determinism, does not require perfect prediction, but only patterns, regularities, laws that hold approximately, and science proceeds without the demon, without omniscience, by finding partial explanations, probabilistic models, statistical regularities, and these are sufficient for understanding, for technology, for navigating the world. And the demon's impossibility does not doom science but liberates it, frees it from the burden of total prediction, allows it to focus on what can be known rather than lamenting what cannot. The demon sits in conceptual space, all-knowing and impotent, knowing everything but unable to act, unable to exist, blocked by uncertainty, by chaos, by computation, and Laplace's vision of a deterministic clockwork universe fades, replaced by a more subtle picture, a universe governed by laws but not wholly determined, open to chance, to randomness, to emergence, where the future is not written in the present but unfolds through processes that are partly lawful and partly random, and free will, though not proven, is at least not obviously refuted, and moral responsibility, though challenged, survives because even if determinism were true, even if all actions are caused by prior states, we still distinguish between actions that flow from deliberation and those that do not, between agents who respond to reasons and those who do not, and these distinctions matter, ground our practices of praise and blame, and Laplace's demon, impossible and paradoxical, remains a touchstone in debates about determinism, free will, and the limits of knowledge, a thought experiment that has shaped centuries of discussion and continues to challenge our understanding of what it means to predict, to know, and to be free. Fichte's paradox of knowability. There is an appealing idea in philosophy, a principle that seems to capture something important about truth and knowledge, and this is the knowability principle, which states that all truths are knowable, that for any true proposition there is at least a possible situation in which someone knows that proposition, and this principle seems modest, even Platonic in spirit, suggesting that truth and knowledge are intimately connected, that reality is not fundamentally hidden or inaccessible, that the universe is intelligible in principle, even if not all truths are actually known by anyone at any given time. The principle distinguishes between what is known and what is knowable, acknowledging that many truths remain unknown, perhaps because no one has investigated them, or because the evidence is lost, or because the relevant questions have not yet been asked, but insisting that these unknown truths could be known, that there is no barrier in principle preventing them from being discovered. And this seems like a reasonable position, neither too strong like the claim that all truths are actually known, which is obviously false, nor too weak like the claim that some truths are unknowable, which seems to concede too much to skepticism and to suggest that reality contains secrets that are forever beyond our reach. But in 1963, Friedrich Fichte proved a shocking result, a theorem showing that if the knowability principle is true, then all truths are actually known, that the modest principle collapses into the absurdly strong claim it was meant to avoid. And this result, known as Fichte's paradox or the knowability paradox, has profound implications for epistemology, the philosophy of language, and debates about realism and anti-realism, and it forces philosophers to choose between giving up the knowability principle, accepting the absurd conclusion that all truths are known, or finding some way to reformulate the principle to avoid the paradox. The proof is elegant and surprisingly simple. Proceeding by reductio ad absurdum, suppose there is a truth that is unknown, call it P, and suppose also that no one knows that P is an unknown truth. That is, no one knows the conjunction P, and P is not known. And now apply the knowability principle, which says that this conjunction, being true, must be knowable, must be such that someone could know it. But here a contradiction emerges, because to know a conjunction, one must know both conjuncts. So to know P and P is not known, one must know P and also know that P is not known. But if one knows P, then P is known, which contradicts the second conjunct that P is not known. And so the conjunction P and P is not known cannot be known. It is an unknowable truth, and this contradicts the knowability principle, and therefore the assumption that there is an unknown truth must be false, and so all truths must be known. The paradox depends on the assumption that knowledge distributes over conjunction, that if you know P and Q, then you know P and you know Q, which seems uncontroversial, and on the assumption that knowledge is factive, that if you know P, then P is true, which is a standard requirement in epistemology, and so the paradox cannot be easily dismissed as relying on dubious principles. It seems to follow from our ordinary understanding of knowledge and knowability, and yet the conclusion is unacceptable. The claim that all truths are actually known is empirically false. There are obviously truths about the distant past, about the far reaches of the universe, about the inner workings of consciousness that no one knows. And so something must give, either the knowability principle or the reasoning that derives the paradox from it. One response is to reject the knowability principle, to accept that there are unknowable truths, truths that could never be known by anyone under any circumstances. And this is the position of semantic realists, who argue that truth is independent of our capacity to recognize it, that reality outstrips our epistemic abilities, that the world contains facts that are forever beyond our ken. And for realists, the knowability paradox is not a disaster, but a vindication, a proof that the anti-realist commitment to knowability is untenable, that we must accept a more robust conception of truth as radically independent of knowledge. Another response, favoured by anti-realists and verificationists, is to reformulate the knowability principle to avoid the paradox while preserving the intuition that truth and knowability are connected, and various reformulations have been proposed. Some restrict knowability to propositions that do not involve knowledge ascriptions. Avoiding the problematic self-referential structure of P and P is not known. Others distinguish between individual and collective knowability, arguing that all truths are knowable by the epistemic community as a whole, even if not by any single individual, and still others embrace a temporal or modal reformulation, claiming that all truths could have been known at some time or in some possible world, rather than claiming that all truths are actually knowable in all circumstances. Some philosophers argue that the paradox reveals a tension in the concept of knowability itself, that knowability is not a simple modal notion, but involves complex interactions between truth, knowledge, and the conditions under which knowledge is possible, and that our intuitions about these interactions are unreliable, pulled in different directions by competing commitments, and so the paradox exposes an instability in our conceptual scheme, rather than refuting any particular philosophical position. The paradox also connects to debates about the nature of propositions and the objects of knowledge. Because the problematic conjunction P and P is not known seems strange, it is a proposition about itself in a way, a proposition whose truth depends on whether it is known, and this self-referential or quasi-self-referential structure is reminiscent of the liar paradox and other semantic paradoxes, and some responses to Fichte's paradox draw on strategies developed for dealing with those paradoxes, such as hierarchies of languages, restrictions on self-reference, or non-classical logics that reject certain principles like the law of excluded middle. The paradox has implications for constructivism in mathematics and logic, because constructivists typically endorse some version of the knowability principle, identifying truth with provability or constructibility, and Fichte's paradox threatens this identification, suggesting that even constructivists must either accept that all mathematical truths are already proved, which is absurd, or abandon the simple identification of truth with provability and develop a more nuanced account of the relationship between the two. The knowability principle, innocent as it seemed, turns out to be a Trojan horse, a seemingly modest claim that conceals a radical commitment, and Fichte's paradox forces philosophers to confront the costs of various epistemological positions, to choose between realism with its unknowable truths and anti-realism with its need to reformulate or restrict the knowability principle. And the paradox remains a central puzzle in contemporary epistemology, a test case for theories of truth and knowledge, a proof that demonstrates with crystalline clarity that even the most intuitive principles can lead to absurdity when their logical consequences are rigorously traced. And it stands as a reminder that philosophy is not merely a matter of articulating and defending intuitions, but of following arguments wherever they lead, even when they lead to conclusions that undermine the very intuitions that motivated them. And the unknown truth, the proposition that is true but not known, sits at the center of the paradox, both knowable and unknowable, possible and impossible, a conceptual anomaly that refuses to be tamed by logic or softened by reformulation. And the paradox endures, a monument to the power of formal reasoning, to reveal deep tensions in our most basic concepts, tensions that no amount of philosophical maneuvering has yet managed to resolve in a way that satisfies all intuitions and preserves all principles. And so the debate continues, philosophers proposing new solutions, new restrictions, new interpretations, and the paradox persists, waiting to trap the unwary, to challenge the confident, to remind us that even truth and knowledge, the twin pillars of epistemology, are stranger and more problematic than they first appear. Liebert's experiments, paradox why your brain decides before you do. A neuroscientist named Benjamin Libet designs an experiment to investigate the timing of conscious decision-making to discover when conscious intention arises relative to brain activity and action. And subjects sit before a screen with a moving dot like a clock hand, and they are instructed to flex their wrist whenever they feel like it, spontaneously, without planning in advance, and while they watch the screen, they note the position of the dots when they first become aware of the intention to move, when they first consciously decide to flex. And meanwhile, electrodes measure brain activity, specifically measure the readiness potential, a build-up of neural activity that precedes voluntary movements. And Libet's finding is striking and controversial. The readiness potential begins several hundred milliseconds before the subject reports conscious awareness of the intention to move. The brain activity precedes conscious intention by about 300 to 500 milliseconds. And this seems to show that the brain decides to move before consciousness decides. That unconscious neural processes initiate the action, and conscious intention is a kind of afterthought, an epiphenomenon, something that arises after the decision has already been made at the unconscious level. And this finding appears to challenge free will, appears to show that conscious decisions do not cause actions but merely accompany them or follow them. And this is Libet's experiment's paradox, the discovery that our conscious intentions come too late to cause our actions, come after the brain has already committed to acting. And this creates philosophical puzzles about the nature of volition, about whether we truly initiate our actions or merely become aware of them after unconscious processes have already set them in motion. Imagine the subject in Libet's experiment, watching the dot move around the screen, waiting for the urge to flex their wrist, and suddenly they feel the intention. They become aware of wanting to move, they experience the conscious decision, and they note the position of the dot. And a moment later, their wrist flexes, and this sequence feels like the intention caused the movement, feels like they decided consciously and then acted. But the brain recordings tell a different story, show that neural activity associated with the movement began several hundred milliseconds before the conscious intention, that the brain was preparing to move, before consciousness knew about it. And this temporal order suggests that consciousness does not initiate action, but only monitors it, only becomes aware of decisions that have already been made unconsciously. And if this is correct, then conscious free will is an illusion, is a feeling that arises after the fact, after unconscious processes have already determined what will happen. The paradox is that subjectively, we feel like we consciously decide and then act, feel like conscious intention is the cause of action, but objectively, the neural evidence suggests that unconscious processes cause both the action and the conscious intention, that consciousness is not in the driver's seat but is a passenger, observing but not controlling. And this disconnect between subjective experience and objective reality creates the paradox, makes us wonder whether free will is real or illusory, whether we are agents who initiate actions or spectators who witness actions that our brains have already decided to perform. Visualize the timeline. At time 0, the readiness potential begins. Unconscious neural activity starts building up. At time 300 milliseconds, the subject becomes consciously aware of the intention to move. At time 500 milliseconds, the movement occurs. And the critical question is what causes what? Does the conscious intention at 300 milliseconds cause the movement at 500? Or does the unconscious readiness potential at time 0 cause both the conscious intention and the movement? And Libet's data suggests the latter, suggests that unconscious brain activity is the real cause, is the initiator, and conscious intention is just another effect, another consequence of the unconscious process. And if this is right, then conscious will is causally inert, does not actually produce behavior, is epiphenomenal. Many philosophers and scientists have challenged Libet's interpretation. One response questions the measurement of conscious intention, argues that asking subjects to note when they became aware of intending is asking them to introspect a process that might not be accessible to introspection, and the reported time of intention might be inaccurate, might be systematically delayed, and subjects might become aware of intending earlier than they report, perhaps at the same time as the readiness potential begins. And if conscious awareness actually coincides with the readiness potential, then there is no paradox. Consciousness is part of the initiating process, not an afterthought. Another response distinguishes between different kinds of decisions, argues that Libet's experiments involve arbitrary decisions, spontaneous movements without specific goals or reasons, and these are not typical of the kinds of decisions we care about when discussing free will. And meaningful choices, choices based on deliberation and reasons, might involve different neural processes, might involve consciousness more centrally. And Libet's findings about arbitrary wrist flexions do not generalize to all decisions, do not show that conscious deliberation is always epiphenomenal, and free will might be preserved for rational choices even if spontaneous impulses are unconsciously initiated. A third response questions the interpretation of the readiness potential, argues that early neural activity does not necessarily represent a decision or commitment to act, but might represent preparation, might be part of the process of forming an intention rather than being the cause of intention, and consciousness might be involved throughout this process. And the readiness potential and conscious intention might be parts of a single, integrated process rather than separate causes. And Libet's interpretation assumes too sharp a separation between unconscious and conscious processes, treats them as competing causes when they might be cooperative aspects of a single decision-making system. Some philosophers embrace Libet's findings, argue that they confirm what we should have known all along, that consciousness does not have magical causal powers, that all mental processes are brain processes, and brain processes are physical processes that operate according to causal laws, and conscious states are aspects of brain states, not separate entities that somehow reach into the physical world to cause behavior. And Libet's experiments help dispel the Cartesian illusion that consciousness is a separate substance with independent causal power, help show that we are physical beings whose actions are caused by physical brain processes, and consciousness is part of this physical system, not a separate controller. Libet himself proposed that consciousness might not initiate actions, but might have a veto power, might be able to stop actions that unconscious processes have initiated. And he found some evidence for this, found that conscious intention could inhibit movements, even after the readiness potential had begun. And this veto function preserves a role for conscious will, makes consciousness a gatekeeper, if not an initiator. And this preserves some form of free will, free won't rather than free will, the ability to consciously inhibit unconsciously initiated impulses. The experiments have been repeated and refined by many researchers, with various results, some confirming Libet's findings and others qualifying them, showing that the relationship between brain activity, conscious awareness, and action is more complex than Libet's original interpretation suggested, and the debate continues with no consensus about what the experiments show about free will, about whether they undermine it or are compatible with it. And the paradox persists as a live issue in neuroscience and philosophy. The subject flexes their wrist, notes the time of intention, and the electrodes record the readiness potential, and the timing reveals that brain activity preceded awareness. And the question remains what this means for free will, whether it shows that consciousness is epiphenomenal, that we do not truly initiate our actions, or whether the interpretation is wrong, whether consciousness is involved earlier than subjects report, or whether the experiments test the wrong kinds of decisions. And Libet's paradox endures as one of the most discussed and controversial findings in the neuroscience of volition, a set of experiments that appears to show that free will is an illusion, that our conscious sense of agency is a feeling that arises after decisions have already been made, And whether this appearance is accurate, whether the paradox is real or illusory, remains one of the most important questions at the intersection of neuroscience and philosophy. And the readiness potential builds, and consciousness awakens, and action follows, and the temporal order creates the paradox, and the debate continues. Epimenides' paradox. A poet from Crete named Epimenides once declared that all Cretans are liars, and this statement, simple as it seems, has echoed through the centuries as one of the earliest recorded paradoxes, a puzzle that predates even the formal study of logic, and yet contains within it the seeds of contradictions that still trouble philosophers today. If Epimenides himself is a Cretan and he claims that all Cretans are liars, then his statement must be a lie. But if his statement is a lie, then not all Cretans are liars, which means some Cretans tell the truth, which could include Epimenides himself, which means his statement might be true after all, which means all Cretans are liars, which means his statement is a lie, and the cycle begins again. The paradox is not quite as airtight as the liar paradox that would emerge later, because calling someone a liar does not mean they always lie, only that they lie sometimes. And so there remains a sliver of logical escape, a possibility that Epimenides is telling the truth on this one occasion while still being a liar in general, or that his statement is partially true and partially false, depending on how it is interpreted. St. Paul referenced the paradox in his letter to Titus, quoting Epimenides and adding that the statement is true, seemingly unaware or unconcerned with the logical contradiction embedded in his endorsement. And this has led to centuries of theological and philosophical debate about what Paul intended and whether Scripture itself contains a paradox. The ancient Greeks recognized the puzzle, but lacked the formal tools to fully analyze it, treating it more as a rhetorical curiosity than a serious threat to logic. And it was not until the development of modern symbolic logic that the deeper implications became clear. The paradox belongs to a family of self-referential statements that collapse under their own weight, and Bertrand Russell would later use variations of this structure to reveal cracks in the foundation of mathematics, proving that not all sets can be safely defined, that not all statements can be assigned a truth value without contradiction. Some philosophers argue that the Epimenides paradox is weaker than its descendants because it depends on empirical facts about Cretans rather than purely logical structure, and that if we simply reject the premise that all Cretans are liars, the paradox dissolves, unlike the pure liar paradox which creates contradiction through its form alone. Others see it as an early recognition that language can turn against itself, that statements about truth and falsehood require careful handling, that self-reference introduces dangers that must be acknowledged and navigated. The paradox also raises questions about identity and generalization, about what it means to make sweeping claims about groups of people, and whether such claims can ever be fully coherent when the speaker is part of the group being described. Epimenides stands at the origin of a long tradition of logical puzzles, his words reverberating through time. A poet who may not have fully understood what he had unleashed, but who nevertheless gave voice to one of the fundamental tensions in human thought, the way that truth can fold back on itself and become strange, unstable, uncertain. McTaggart's paradox of time, why past, present and future are contradictory. A philosopher named J.M.E. McTaggart constructs an argument attempting to prove that time is unreal, that temporal distinctions are contradictory, that past, present and future cannot coexist, and the argument begins by distinguishing two ways of thinking about time: the A series, which orders events as past, present or future, and the B series, which orders events as earlier than or later than each other. And McTaggart argues that the A series is essential to time, that change requires events to move from future to present to past, that without this passage, without the A series, there is no real time. But the A series is contradictory, generates logical problems, and therefore time is unreal, is an appearance generated by our temporal perspective, but does not correspond to ultimate reality. And this is McTaggart's paradox of time, one of the most famous and most controversial arguments in the philosophy of time, an argument that has shaped all subsequent debates about the nature of time, about whether time is real or illusory, about whether the passage of time is objective or subjective. Imagine time as having two aspects: the A-series aspect, where events are classified as past, present, or future, where we say the meeting is future, is happening now in the present, was past yesterday, and events change their A-series position, move from future to present to past, and this movement is time's passage, is what makes time dynamic. And the B-series aspect, where events are ordered as earlier or later, where we say the meeting is later than breakfast and earlier than dinner, and these B-series relations are fixed, do not change. The meeting is always later than breakfast, regardless of when we consider it. And McTaggart argues that the A-series is essential for real time, that the B-series alone is not sufficient, that time requires passage, requires events to change from future to present to past, but the A-series is contradictory, and so time is impossible, is unreal. The paradox emerges from the fact that A-series properties are contradictory. Every event is past and present and future. The meeting is future before it occurs, is present when it occurs, is past after it occurs. And so the meeting has all three properties, is past and present and future. And these properties are incompatible, cannot all be instantiated by the same event. And so the A-series generates contradiction. And the standard response is to say that events have A-series properties at different times. The meeting is future at earlier times, present at its time of occurrence, past at later times. And this seems to resolve the contradiction by indexing A-series properties to times. But McTaggart argues this does not help, because now we must ask whether the times themselves are past, present, or future. And the same problem recurs. If the time at which the meeting is future is itself past, then the meeting is past and future, and contradiction remains. And indexing to times does not eliminate the contradiction, but only pushes it back. McTaggart argues that the only way to avoid contradiction is to eliminate the A-series, to accept that events do not really move from future to present to past. That passage is illusory, that reality consists only of the B-series, only of earlier-later relations. But the B-series without the A-series is not real time, is only a static ordering, lacks the dynamism, lacks the passage that is essential to time. And so time is unreal, is an appearance that our consciousness generates from a fundamentally timeless reality. And McTaggart's position is a form of idealism about time, treats time as mind-dependent, as not part of the ultimate structure of reality. Visualize the paradox as a vicious circle. Events have A-series properties, but these properties are contradictory. So we index them to times, but then times have A-series properties, which are contradictory. So we index to second-order times, but these are contradictory, and the regress continues. And the contradiction is never eliminated, only relocated. And McTaggart concludes that the A-series is inherently contradictory, cannot be made coherent, and must be rejected. And with it goes time itself, which requires the A-series for its reality. One response to McTaggart's paradox, the tenseless or B-theory response, accepts McTaggart's argument that the A-series is contradictory, but denies that time requires the A-series, argues that the B-series is sufficient for real time, that earlier-later relations constitute time, and passage is an illusion, is a feature of our temporal perspective, and the universe exists as a four-dimensional block, a block universe where all times are equally real, and past, present, and future are not objective features of reality, but are indexical, are relative to a perspective. And this B-theory has become orthodoxy in philosophy of time, is widely accepted as avoiding McTaggart's paradox while preserving the reality of time. Another response, the tensed or A-theory response, denies that the A series is contradictory, argues that McTaggart's argument involves a mistake, that A series properties are not really contradictory because they are indexed to times in a non-problematic way, and the meeting being future at T1 and past at T2 is not contradictory, is just the normal way temporal properties work. And A theorists argue that passage is real, that the present is objectively real, that the future is open and the past is fixed. And McTaggart's argument fails because it assumes that A-series properties must be simultaneous to be contradictory when they are not simultaneous, are at different times, and this response preserves the A-series, preserves passage, and rejects McTaggart's conclusion that time is unreal. A third response from presentism argues that only the present exists, that past and future are unreal, and so events do not have contradictory A-series properties because only present events exist, and only present properties are real, and the meeting is not simultaneously past, present, and future because only one of these is real at any time. And presentism avoids McTaggart's paradox by radical ontological restriction, by accepting that most of time does not exist, and this preserves the reality of the present, preserves passage, but faces difficulties explaining how truths about past and future can be true if past and future do not exist. McTaggart's paradox has been enormously influential, has shaped all debates about time, has forced philosophers to clarify their positions, to distinguish A theories from B theories, to recognize that different conceptions of time have different metaphysical commitments, and the paradox remains controversial, remains debated, with some accepting McTaggart's conclusion that time is unreal, some accepting that the A series is contradictory, but denying that this makes time unreal, and some denying that the A series is contradictory, and no consensus exists, and the paradox endures as one of the most important arguments in metaphysics, an argument that challenges our ordinary understanding of time, forces recognition that temporal passage, the movement from future through present to past, is philosophically problematic, and whether time is real or illusory remains one of philosophy's deepest questions. And McTaggart's paradox continues to structure the debate, continues to force philosophers to grapple with the nature of time, with whether passage is objective or subjective, with whether reality is a static four-dimensional block or a dynamic unfolding present, and the paradox persists, unsolved and perhaps unsolvable, a permanent challenge to theories of time. Goodman's Grue paradox. When emeralds turn blue at midnight, a philosopher invents a new colour term, grue, and grue is defined as follows. An object is grue if it is observed before time t and is green, or if it is not observed before time t and is blue, where t is some future date, perhaps January 1st of next year. And this definition is strange, is artificial, combines observation and time in a way that ordinary colour terms do not. But the definition is precise, is perfectly clear. And now the philosopher considers emeralds and notes that all emeralds observed so far have been green. And these observations support the hypothesis all emeralds are green. And the same observations also support the hypothesis all emeralds are grue because all observed emeralds satisfy both descriptions. They are green, which means they are grue up to time t, and both hypotheses are equally well supported by the evidence. Both fit all observations perfectly, and yet the two hypotheses make different predictions about the future. The first predicts that emeralds examined after time t will be green. The second predicts they will be blue. And so we have two hypotheses, equally supported by evidence, making opposite predictions. And the question is, which hypothesis should we believe? Which generalization should we project into the future? And Nelson Goodman poses this as a problem about projectability, about which predicates can legitimately be used in inductive inferences. And this is the Grue paradox, also called Goodman's new riddle of induction, a puzzle that shows that not all evidence-supported hypotheses are equal, that some predicates are projectable and others are not, and the challenge is to explain what makes green projectable and GRU not, what distinguishes legitimate from illegitimate generalizations. Imagine living in a world where emeralds are GRU, where all emeralds observed before time t are green, but all emeralds examined after time t are blue. And from the perspective of someone before time t, this is indistinguishable from a world where emeralds are simply green. All observations are the same, and yet the two worlds are radically different, will diverge dramatically after time t. And the puzzle is that evidence accumulated before t does not distinguish between these possibilities, does not tell us which world we inhabit, and so induction alone cannot determine which hypothesis to accept, cannot tell us whether emeralds are green or GRU. And this reveals that induction requires more than just fitting evidence, requires principles about which predicates are projectable, which generalizations are legitimate. And these principles cannot themselves be justified inductively without circularity. Visualize the timeline with time t marking a boundary, and on one side of the boundary, all observed emeralds are green. And the question is what happens after the boundary. Do emeralds remain green, or do they become blue? And the hypothesis, all emeralds are GRU, says they switch colours. But this switching is built into the definition of GRU, is a feature of how the predicate is defined rather than a feature of emeralds themselves. And this reveals something important, that the GRU hypothesis is gerrymandered, is artificially constructed to fit past observations while making a different prediction about the future. And our intuition is that such gerrymandered hypotheses should not be projected, should not be taken seriously, but explaining why requires articulating a principle that distinguishes natural from gerrymandered predicates. Goodman's own solution appeals to entrenchment, argues that green is projectable because it has been used successfully in many past inductions, has become entrenched in our language and our theories, while GRU is a newcomer, is defined artificially, has no history of successful projection, and so we should prefer green over GRU, not for any logical reason, but for pragmatic reasons, because green has proven its worth. And this solution ties projectability to linguistic and scientific practice, makes it a matter of history rather than logic. And some find this unsatisfying, find it too relativistic. But Goodman argues that there is no deeper justification available, that entrenchment is as good as justification gets for inductive inference. Another response argues that GRU is not a genuine predicate, is not natural, because it is defined in terms of observation and time, includes reference to specific moments and observers, and genuine properties should be observer-independent, should not change based on when or whether they are observed. And green is natural in this sense, refers to a real property that objects have regardless of observation, while GRU is artificial, is defined through disjunction and reference to observation, and so only natural predicates are projectable. And this solution requires explaining what makes a predicate natural, what distinguishes genuine properties from artificial constructions. And this leads to metaphysical questions about the nature of properties, about whether naturalness is objective or conventional. A third response from a Bayesian perspective argues that GRU hypotheses are less probable than green hypotheses given reasonable priors, because GRU hypotheses postulate discontinuities, postulate that properties change suddenly at arbitrary times, and such discontinuities require explanation, require reasons, and in the absence of such reasons we should assign low prior probability to GRU hypotheses. And so while GRU fits the evidence as well as green, GRU is less probable overall because of its lower prior, and this solution appeals to simplicity and parsimony, treats continuous properties as more probable than discontinuous ones, and explains projectability in terms of prior probabilities rather than entrenchment or naturalness. The Grue paradox also reveals that the problem of induction is deeper than Hume recognized, because Hume worried about justifying any inductive inference, about showing that the future will resemble the past. But even if we accept induction, we face Goodman's problem. We must choose which respects the future will resemble the past, must decide which predicates to project, and different choices lead to different predictions. And there is no algorithm, no mechanical procedure that tells us which predicates are projectable, which generalizations are legitimate. And so induction requires judgment, requires background knowledge, requires engagement with the actual practice of science rather than pure logical analysis. The paradox extends beyond emeralds and colours to any inductive inference, to all attempts to generalize from observed to unobserved cases, because for any pattern we observe, for any regularity we find, there are infinite Grue-like predicates that fit the pattern up to now, but diverge in the future, and choosing between these predicates cannot be done on evidential grounds alone, requires additional principles, requires distinguishing projectable from non-projectable predicates. And every scientific theory makes such choices, implicitly assumes that certain predicates are natural and others artificial. And Goodman's paradox makes these assumptions explicit, forces recognition that induction is not just about fitting evidence, but about choosing the right vocabulary, the right predicates, the right way of carving up the world. The clock approaches time t, and emeralds remain green, as they always have been, and the Grue hypothesis is refuted, is shown to have been wrong. But before time t, the evidence supported Grue as much as green, and this shows that evidence alone was insufficient, that something beyond evidence guided our preference for green, our confidence that emeralds would remain green rather than turning blue, and that something is what Goodman's paradox investigates, what it challenges used to articulate, and the paradox remains not fully resolved, not answered by any single theory that satisfies everyone, but persistent as a challenge to theories of induction, a test case for accounts of scientific reasoning, and a reminder that generalizing from experience requires more than logic, requires substantive assumptions about the world, about which properties are real and which are artificial, about which patterns will continue and which will break. And these assumptions cannot be justified inductively without circularity, cannot be proven logically without begging the question. And so induction rests ultimately on judgment, on practices that have proven successful, on entrenchment or naturalness or simplicity. And Goodman's Grue paradox reveals this foundation, exposes the principles we rely on but cannot fully justify. And the paradox endures as one of the most important problems in philosophy of science. Grandi's series, when adding numbers, forever gives multiple answers. A simple mathematical series begins with 1 minus 1 plus 1 minus 1 plus 1 minus 1, continuing forever without end, alternating between adding 1 and subtracting 1. And the question emerges, what does this infinite sum equal? What value does it approach as more and more terms are added? And the paradox is that different methods of calculation give different answers, each seemingly valid, each following mathematical rules, yet reaching contradictory conclusions. And this is Grandi's series, named after the Italian mathematician Guido Grandi, who studied it in the early 18th century. And the paradox reveals fundamental questions about what it means to sum an infinite sequence, about whether all infinite series have definite values, and about the limits of algebraic manipulation when dealing with infinity. Consider the series visually. Imagine a number line where you start at 0, then move 1 unit to the right to reach 1, then move 1 unit to the left back to 0, then 1 unit right to 1 again, then 1 unit left to 0, and this pattern continues forever, oscillating between 0 and 1, never settling down, never approaching a limit in the traditional sense. And so, from this perspective, the series does not converge, does not have a sum. The partial sums bounce between 0 and 1 eternally and never stabilize. But now consider a different approach. Group the terms in pairs. taking 1 minus 1 as the first pair, which equals 0, then 1 minus 1 as the second pair, also 0, and so on. And the series becomes 0 plus 0 plus 0, continuing forever, and the sum of infinitely many zeros is 0. And so by this grouping method, the series equals 0. And this seems like a valid manipulation. Grouping terms is a standard algebraic operation, and yet it produces a definite answer where the oscillating view produced no answer. Now consider another grouping. Start by leaving the first one alone, then group all subsequent pairs, so the series becomes 1 plus the quantity negative 1 plus 1, then the quantity negative 1 plus 1, and so on. And each grouped pair equals 0. So the series becomes 1 plus 0 plus 0 plus 0, continuing forever. And this equals 1. And so by this different grouping, the series equals 1 instead of 0. And both groupings seem legitimate. Both use standard algebraic rules, yet they produce different answers, 0 and 1. And this is the heart of Grandi's paradox, that the series is sensitive to how it is manipulated, that rearranging or regrouping terms changes the result. And this suggests that the series does not have a well-defined sum in the ordinary sense. Mathematicians have developed sophisticated tools to handle divergent series, like Grandi's, and one approach is Cesaro summation, which assigns values to series by averaging the partial sums. And for Grandi's series, the partial sums are 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, continuing to alternate, and the average of the first n partial sums approaches 1/2 as n grows large, because roughly half the partial sums are 1 and half are 0. And so by Cesaro summation, Grandi's series equals 1/2, and this method produces yet another answer, neither 0 nor 1, but the midpoint between them. And this answer has a certain aesthetic appeal. It represents the average behavior of the series, the value around which it oscillates, and it can be justified by analogy to functions. If you consider the geometric series 1 minus x plus x squared minus x cubed and so on, which converges to 1 over 1 plus x for absolute value of x less than 1, and you plug in x equals 1, you get 1 over 2. And so in some extended sense, Grandi's series can be said to equal 1/2. The paradox reveals that divergent series do not have sums in the way convergent series do, that assigning values to them requires making choices about what summation method to use, and different methods give different results. And there is no single correct answer, but rather a family of possible values, depending on the context and the techniques employed. And this multiplicity is not a flaw in mathematics, but a feature, a recognition that infinite sums are more subtle than finite sums, that operations that work for finite cases can break down or become ambiguous when extended to infinity. Grandi's series appears in physics and engineering, in Fourier analysis, where oscillating sums arise naturally, in quantum field theory, where divergent series are regularized using techniques similar to Cesaro summation, and in signal processing, where alternating patterns must be analyzed. And in these applications, the choice of summation method is guided by physical considerations, by what gives useful predictions, by what aligns. With experimental results, and the paradox becomes less troubling, less a contradiction, and more a reminder that mathematical tools must be adapted to fit the problem, that formal manipulation must be tempered with judgment about what makes sense in context. The series also appears in philosophical discussions about infinity, about whether infinite processes can be completed, about whether the phrase, sum of infinitely many terms, has a determinate meaning or depends on conventions and choices. And Grandi's series suggests the latter, that infinity introduces ambiguities that finite mathematics avoids, that extending concepts from finite to infinite is not automatic but requires care, requires new definitions, requires acceptance, that some questions have multiple answers or no answer at all depending on how they are framed. Imagine watching someone walk back and forth on a path, taking one step forward, then one step back, then one step forward, then one step back, forever, without stopping, and you are asked where they end up, and the answer is that they do not end up anywhere. They continue oscillating. But if you ask where they are on average, you might say they are halfway between the two endpoints. And if you ask where they are after an even number of steps, you say at the start. And after an odd number, you say one step forward, and none of these answers is wrong. Each captures a different aspect of the situation, and Grandi's series is similar. Different questions about the series have different answers, and the paradox arises from expecting a single answer when the situation is inherently ambiguous, when the infinite oscillation resists reduction to a single number. The series continues, 1 minus 1 plus 1 minus 1, terms alternating forever, and the sum is 0 or 1 or 1/2 depending on how you calculate it, depending on what method you use, depending on what question you're really asking. And the paradox endures, a simple series that exposes deep issues about infinity, about summation, about the limits of algebraic manipulation, and about the need for careful definitions when dealing with infinite processes. And Grandi's series remains a teaching tool, a cautionary tale, a reminder that infinity is subtle, that divergent series require special handling, and that mathematics is not just calculation, but interpretation, not just following rules, but understanding when rules apply and when they break down. And the series oscillates, forever unresolved, forever producing different answers, and the paradox persists, elegant and instructive, a monument to the strangeness of infinity and the care required when extending finite concepts to the infinite realm. Frankfurt's counterexamples. When you're responsible. Even though you had no choice, a person decides to perform an action, decides on their own, without coercion, based on their own reasons and desires, and they perform the action, and we say they are morally responsible. They acted freely. They deserve praise or blame for what they did. And traditional theories of moral responsibility say that responsibility requires the ability to do otherwise, requires that the person could have chosen differently, that they had genuine alternatives, and this principle, called the principle of alternate possibilities, seems obvious, seems essential to responsibility, because how can you be responsible for an action if you had no choice, if you were forced to do it, if no alternative was possible? And yet philosopher Harry Frankfurt constructed examples that challenge this principle. Examples where a person acts on their own, makes their own decision, but could not have done otherwise, and yet intuitively seems responsible. And these are Frankfurt's counterexamples. Thought experiments designed to show that the principle of alternate possibilities is false, that responsibility does not require the ability to do otherwise, that what matters is how you acted, whether the action flowed from your own will, not whether you could have acted differently. And Frankfurt's cases have been enormously influential, have reshaped debates about free will and responsibility, have challenged incompatibilist arguments that say determinism undermines responsibility, and the counterexamples remain controversial, remain debated, but have permanently changed the landscape of discussions about freedom. Imagine the example: a person named Jones decides to perform an action, decides to vote for a certain candidate, and Jones makes this decision on his own, based on his own political views, his own deliberation. No one forces him, no one coerces him, and he goes to vote, and he is about to vote for the candidate he chose. And at this moment, unbeknownst to Jones, there is another person, call him Black, who has been monitoring Jones's brain states, and Black has the ability to intervene, to manipulate Jones's brain, to force Jones to vote for the candidate if Jones shows signs of changing his mind, and Black is prepared to intervene, but does not need to, because Jones votes for the candidate on his own, makes the decision himself, and Black's intervention mechanism remains dormant, unused. And the question Frankfurt asks is whether Jones is morally responsible for his vote, and intuitively the answer is yes. Jones voted based on his own decision, his own reasons. Black's presence made no difference. Black did nothing, and Jones is responsible just as he would be if Black did not exist. And yet Jones could not have done otherwise, because if he had tried to vote differently, Black would have intervened, would have forced him to vote for the candidate. And so Jones had no alternative, could not have avoided voting as he did, and yet he is responsible. And this shows that responsibility does not require the ability to do otherwise, that the principle of alternate possibilities is false. The structure of Frankfurt cases involves two elements. The person acts on their own, based on their own will, their own reasons, and there is a counterfactual intervener, someone or something that would have prevented any alternative action, that ensures the person does what they do, but the intervener does not actually act, remains dormant, and so the person's action is their own, even though alternatives were blocked. And Frankfurt argues that what matters for responsibility is not whether alternatives existed, but whether the person acted on their own, whether their action flowed from their own will, and in Frankfurt cases, the action does flow from the person's own will, and so they are responsible even though they could not have done otherwise. Visualize moral responsibility as depending on the actual sequence, on how the action was actually produced, rather than on alternative sequences on what might have happened, and in Frankfurt cases the actual sequence is normal. The person deliberates and chooses and acts, while alternative sequences are blocked by the intervener. And since responsibility depends on the actual sequence, the person is responsible, and the blocked alternatives are irrelevant. And this shows that incompatibilists are wrong to think that determinism, by ruling out alternatives, undermines responsibility, because even if determinism rules out alternatives, as long as people act on their own, based on their own reasons, they are responsible, and responsibility is compatible with determinism. Critics of Frankfurt cases have offered various objections. One objection denies that the person really lacked alternatives, argues that in Frankfurt cases there are flicker alternatives, tiny alternatives, that remain open until the very last moment, moments where the person could begin to choose differently before the intervener stops them, and these flickers are enough to preserve the principle of alternate possibilities, enough to ground responsibility, and so Frankfurt cases do not refute the principle, only show that responsibility does not require robust alternatives, only requires minimal alternatives, tiny flickers of freedom. Another objection questions whether Frankfurt cases really elicit the intuition that the person is responsible, argues that when we imagine the cases carefully, when we recognize that the person truly could not have done otherwise, our intuition of responsibility weakens. And maybe Jones is not fully responsible. Maybe the presence of Black's intervention mechanism, even though unused, affects responsibility, creates a situation where praise and blame are inappropriate, and this response denies that Frankfurt cases generate clear counterexamples, argues that intuitions are unclear or support the principle of alternate possibilities rather than undermining it. A third objection distinguishes between moral responsibility and blameworthiness, argues that Frankfurt cases might show that people can be causally responsible, can be the source of an action, even without alternatives. But this does not show they are morally responsible, does not show they deserve blame or praise, and moral responsibility requires more than being the source of action, requires the ability to do otherwise, requires that the person had control, and Frankfurt cases do not establish moral responsibility, only causal responsibility. Frankfurt has refined his examples over decades, responding to objections, constructing new variants, and the debate continues, with defenders arguing that Frankfurt cases successfully refute the principle of alternate possibilities, show that compatibilism is correct, that responsibility does not require alternatives, and critics arguing that the cases are flawed, that intuitions are unclear, that responsibility does require alternatives after all, and no consensus has emerged. but Frankfurt's contribution is undeniable, has forced philosophers to clarify what responsibility requires, to distinguish between different kinds of freedom, different kinds of control, and to recognize that the relationship between determinism and responsibility is more complex than simple, incompatibilist arguments suggest. Frankfurt's counterexamples also connect to debates about moral luck, about whether responsibility depends on factors beyond our control, because in Frankfurt cases the person is responsible, even though whether alternatives were available was beyond their control, was determined by Black's presence, and this suggests that responsibility is not undermined by factors beyond our control, is not sensitive to luck, and what matters is the actual sequence, how the person actually acted, not whether they were lucky enough to have alternatives. Jones stands in the voting booth, marks his ballot, and Black watches, does nothing, and Jones is responsible, is praised or blamed for his vote, and yet he could not have voted otherwise. And Frankfurt's case challenges traditional assumptions, challenges the principle of alternate possibilities, and forces recognition that responsibility is about actual causation, about whether the person's will was effective, not about whether alternatives existed. And Frankfurt's counterexamples endure as some of the most important thought experiments in philosophy of action, examples that reshaped debates about free will, that challenged incompatibilist arguments, that supported compatibilism, and that remain controversial, remain debated, but have permanently influenced how philosophers think about moral responsibility, about what it requires, about whether determinism threatens it, and the counterexamples persist as permanent features of the landscape, cases that every theory of responsibility must address, must accommodate or explain away. And Frankfurt's legacy includes these cases, these examples that showed that responsibility might not require what we thought it required, might not depend on alternatives, but on something else, on source, on causation, on whether the action flows from the agent's own will. And the debate continues, and Jones votes, and Black does nothing, and the question remains whether Jones is responsible, and Frankfurt says yes. And the counterexamples stand, challenging, probing, revealing complexity in concepts we thought were simple.